People of the universe and art lovers everywhere, I'm Matt Micucci and this is Matt's Art Chat, my weekly series of podcast conversations about the arts with creators, curators, experts and art lovers from all over the world. People of the universe and art lovers everywhere, welcome to the final episode of Matt's Art Chat of 2020. And boy, what a year it has been. Probably the most tumultuous in my lifetime. For someone who leads as nomadic a lifestyle as myself, the pandemic and lockdowns have certainly found a way to force me to stay still longer than I ever have since the days of working in a factory. But the times have not prevented me from discovering new artworks of all sorts. I probably have read more than I have in some years, sticking quite faithfully to the personal rule I have of reading one book and a half a week, along with watching one film a day and listening to 3 new music albums a week. And in fact, among my favourite art discoveries of the year have been the writings of Martin GAYFORD, who is an acclaimed art critic and author of several books on the arts, including major biographies of artists and reflections on the arts or recollections of his own personal experiences in what he defines as the pursuit of art. I have also watched some of the videos and talks of his, online, and I do find him to be a very inspiring communicator on the topic of the arts. I can safely say that he has quickly become a reference point for me in what I do or what I desperately attempt to do. So for the final episode of my little podcast series of conversations about the arts, I wanted to make sure to offer a special episode, and Martin was great enough to agree to let me ask him a few questions, and he was so generous with his answers. Really, I couldn't thank him enough. Honestly, I could have asked him way more, but somehow managed to squeeze some of what I wanted to ask him, including his work on his major Michelangelo biography, which I have read, and also, what it was like to pose for Lucian Freud, and even what jazz music he has currently been listening to, knowing that he is a fellow jazz aficionado. So, with all that being said, I hope you will enjoy this episode of Matt's Art Chat, starring or featuring the great art critic, historian and author Martin GAYFORD. Fire up an Audiotini, sit back, relax, and listen to the audio waves as they fly through the air. Hi, Martin. Thank you for doing this. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, it's a pleasure, Matt. So thank you for asking me.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure is all mine. I've been reading some of your books, over the past while. They've really helped me through some difficult times in the times of COVID. Actually, that's sort of what I wanted to start with, because the latest book of yours I've read is The Pursuit of Art, which is all about your travels to all these different places and experiencing art in the flesh. And so I just kind of wanted to ask you how you've been dealing or adjusting to the 2020 restrictions.
Well, yes, the publication date of that book was a bit ironic because it was autumn 2019, so it was only a few months before the virus appeared, and all the travel I was writing about became completely impossible. And so the next book, which is finished but won't come out for a few months, maybe February, March 21, is actually all about lockdown, and it's about what an artist friend of mine, David Hockney, has been doing, who was sort of always intended to spend this year at a little farmhouse and a bit of land he's bought in northern France, but he'd only got there a week or two before France was locked down, and he's been there more or less continuously ever since. And he's done over 200 drawings of just the trees and the plants and the surroundings, a little stream at the bottom of his meadow. And the book's all about that, and about thoughts arising from that and conversations. We spend a lot of time talking on FaceTime usually, so having video conversations, and the book's grown out of that. So it's really a book which is all predicated on lockdown and how how in a way it can expand your mind because you concentrate more and more on your surroundings, which is what artists often do.
And is that also, just working on that book, have you had to adapt to new technologies and new ways of working?
Well, a little bit. I mean, it pushed me on to discover, I hadn't realized before, I've been talking to artists for decades, but I've always just recorded audio before, and I discovered that, especially with people I already know, that a video conversation of some kind is actually a pretty effective sort of way of interviewing somebody. So it's not just David. I was talking to an artist I know who's got a studio in upstate New York. So instead of getting on a plane and going on a 6,000-mile round trip and traveling up the Hudson, I just talked to him from my sitting room, and actually that worked pretty well. For me, that's a little bit of a breakthrough. I don't think I'll always want to do interviews like that, but under certain circumstances, that might work very well.
Yeah, when did you discover your passion for the arts? Or was there a specific event that prompted you to kind of pursue your interest in the arts? Well,
strange enough, that was something I was talking about with Hockney. I'm not sure if that conversation got into the final cut of the book, but David felt he wanted to be a painter, I think, before he'd really even seen a painting. There was something about the idea of it which appealed to him as a little boy in Bradford, probably 75 years or more ago. And my earliest memory in that connection is a calendar which my father was an electrical engineer, and a company which made valves, which were a component of old-fashioned televisions and radios and things. It's a piece of technology which is now thoroughly obsolete and you'd probably only see in museums. Anyway, this firm manufactured valves, and they sent my father a calendar to promote their product, which had a different British painting for every month. And my mother hung it up in the kitchen, and I must have been, 4 or 5 or 6 maybe. And I just remember looking at it, and I was very interested in each image. So I can still remember quite a few of the paintings which were on that calendar. And I think that was the first thing that I can vividly recall in that connection. And another thing was that one of my grandmothers was an amateur painter, and I remember sitting next to her. She did watercolors of, she'd have never seen, and we'd sit on the cliffs, and she was painting away, and that interested me too.
And did you initially think about becoming an artist?
Well, I think the idea did cross my mind when I was in my teens. I was quite a keen, not just painter. I made collages, made various kinds of objects, and in a style which was probably a bit connected with the times. This would have been the late 60s, and Robert Rauschenberg and American pop art and that kind of thing were in my mind. But in the end, I feel I probably just didn't want to do it enough. I got an offer from a university, and that struck me as very appealing, and I didn't apply to art school. And I think if I'd really been if you're really an artist, then that's the only thing you want to do. And so life took a slightly different course for me.
But do you ever find that the way in which you approach what you do, you approach it almost as if you were an artist?
Well, I like to think that I have a sense of how artists' mental processes work. And I think in a way it's helpful. It's a bit helpful now to me not to be a practicing artist, because I think if you're thinking about your own work, then that slightly gets in the way of thinking about other people's, or of thinking about it completely objectively, because you're bound to think about it from the starting point of what you're doing yourself, I think, otherwise. So I think it is a lot of what I'm doing is to do, when I'm writing, is to do with trying to work out what artists' motivations were, how they were approaching a subject, and that applies to books I've written about artists quite deep in the past, so Van Gogh and John Constable and Michelangelo are among my subjects, and in a way that's not too different to me to the process of writing about somebody who's still alive and who I can phone up and talk to.
So psychology is a starting point for you when you approach, the artist that you write about.
Well, it's the artist's point of view. I mean, I'm more interested in what artists have to say and what they think and what they do than in what, say, historians say about art. Because I feel my hunch about the way it works has always been that the artists are in the driving seat, and really they control the direction of art rather than social factors, say, or economic factors, or other kinds of causes that are sometimes written about. I mean, those may play a part too, but I think my experience of art is that they're such strong individuals, and they have such a powerful sense of where they want to go that they end up very often, if they're strong enough and good enough, they end up taking the whole of the process with them. So, I mean, I don't think art would be what it is today if it hadn't been for Pablo Picasso, for example, or if it hadn't been for Rembrandt van Rijn or Andy Warhol, or all sorts of people.
So, Martin, do you remember who was the first artist that you sort of started writing about passionately, and maybe your first major project?
Well, my first book was about Vincent van Gogh, but possibly that was a bit coloured by an artist I was talking to a lot at that time, who was Lucian Freud, who was a great admirer of Van Gogh, and I was sitting to him for a portrait at the time, so we spent a lot of time together, and I think some of Lucian's ideas and admiration for Van Gogh were channeled into that book. My book about Van Gogh was just about the period of time in 1888 which he spent in the south of France with Paul Gauguin. And in a funny sort of way, what Lucy and I were doing was also about two men sitting in a room together talking, which is what Van Gogh and Gauguin spent a lot of time doing. So it was, although it's a book which is strictly about a historical period, things which were happening to me, I now see, were probably getting mixed into it.
And seeing as you mentioned Lucian Freud, I was going to ask you about this, and I know that you've written about it as well, and you've talked about it in the past, but I just wanted to ask you, what was it like to pose for him?
Well, it was the thing about it which separates it from posing for most artists is that it was a whole epoch in your life. I mean, I spent not quite 2 years, but certainly 18 months regularly going in and spending hours in Lucian's company. So it was it wasn't just a quick in and out, a few sessions. You got to a stage where you couldn't really remember what life had been before you were posing for Lucian, and I remember thinking I was seeing more of him than anybody except my wife and children, and possibly actually talking to him more than anybody at all, because there was nothing else to do. We'd have meals together, and we were sitting together and taking rests when he wasn't painting. So there were hours and hours to do nothing except chat, which was marvelous, actually.
But were you nervous in any way?
I was interested in how the picture was going to turn out, and I wanted to see what kind of image it was going to be. I think nervous would be putting it a bit high, although Possibly I should have been more nervous. It could have turned out, well, various things could have gone wrong, actually. Lucian destroyed quite a lot of pictures if he wasn't satisfied with them, which was disappointing for him, but also disappointing for the sitter, who might have spent 20 or 30 hours on the project at the point when it was suddenly terminated.
I wanted to go back to, let's say, your formative years, and something that I forgot to ask you was whether there was any art critics or historians that you sort of looked up to in those early formative years.
Yes, I think in common with a lot of British people, maybe in America too, but certainly in Britain, there were television series by one was by Kenneth Clarke called Civilization, which I remember watching when it was first broadcast, or certainly the second repeat, and that revealed to me the existence of all sorts of interesting things which I hadn't heard of before in places I'd never been, and it became a sort of bucket list or agenda for me, that he'd been in the series once, or Baroque Rome, or Romanesque architecture in France or something, and that's I wanted to go and see that. And there was also, a bit later, there was a series by an Australian called Robert Hughes called The Shock of the New, which is also quite an eye-opener for me and a lot of people. So those were both, had a bit of an influence. Robert Hughes was somebody I actually met and knew later on. And also quite a few books that had an effect.
So it wasn't just books, it wasn't just books, it was everything.
Yes, and talking to people. I was reminded the other day, because I found a reference to this man in a book I was reviewing, that the head of the French department at our school was a man who was very knowledgeable about art, and a personal friend of various artists, including Henry Moore, who lived not far away from where I went to school, which was in sort of the east of England. And this French master actually had a little Henry Moore. He had various things which possibly art was a bit cheaper in those days. It's hard to imagine a school teacher being able to afford that kind of stuff these days. But he had among other things, he had a small Renoir in the hall. I remember it was a very small Renoir, but even in those days I was a bit startled to see it there. But he'd invite some of the students around and talk about these things, and that was that opened up a sense of possibility.
I can't imagine that either. Owning a Renoir, I'd probably be super nervous, something happening to him.
Yes. I think something happened to the prices of art in the 80s. There was a revolution, and the prices have carried on going up and up and up very, very steeply ever since then.
We'll be back with more from Martin GAYFORD, but first, just a quick break to make sure you knew that there are several more episodes of my series of podcast conversations about the arts with creators, curators, experts, and art lovers from all over the world, and you can stream them on almost all of the audio streaming services out there, including iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and so on. You can also find them on YouTube, which may be a bit handier for folks who are on their laptops. All you have to do is search Matt's Art Chat, and of course, to keep up with all of these different episodes, you can also visit my personal website, inartematt.com. That's INARTEMATT.com. The series features plenty more fascinating guests, including sculptor Daniel Fiorda, talking about his series, Archaeology of the Future.
I always question in everything that I see the relationship between the objects and who have it before, what was the function of that object, and maybe for how many people went through this object before it came to my hands. So I was, in some way, somehow, I was asking questions more like an archaeologist or an anthropologist without conscience of being one, a professional like that.
To listen to the full conversation with Daniel Fiorda and more of my podcast conversations about the arts with creators, curators, experts and art lovers from all over the world, search Matt's Art Chat on most audio streaming platforms, YouTube and my own personal website, inartematt.com. That's INARTEMATT.com. And now, back to my chat with Martin GAYFORD. I recently also read your major biography on Michelangelo, which I thought was amazing, and so now I wanted to ask you about that as well. And again, just a simple question, but what is it that sort of fascinated you about Michelangelo and that prompted you to write this book? Because when I think about it, Michelangelo had such a long life, and he is one of the most famous artists in the world.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, and he's marvelous, and the works are marvelous, and his life was not as uneventful as some artists' lives are. There's plenty of plot there. He was in charge of the defences of Florence during the siege in 1529, 1530, and it was, very nearly could easily have been arrested and executed because the Florentines lost that one, and some of his comrades in arms actually were executed afterwards. But Michelangelo, Pope Clement VII, gave orders that he was to be left alone because he was just too valuable an asset for the papacy and the Medici family to waste by doing away with him like that. I mean, what made him suitable for a book was partly that I felt there was a lot of interesting material there, and also he's immensely well documented. The common factor, which is probably not apparent to readers, or not easily apparent to anyone, between the three historical artists I've written about, is that they were all people who wrote a lot of letters, Constable van Gogh and Michelangelo, and wrote a lot of letters, and those letters were kept. And Michelangelo he came from a Florentine business background. He was the sort of person who filed things, obviously, because there are 5 fat volumes of his collected correspondence, and a lot of contracts and memoranda and all sorts of things remained. And he obviously personally must have kept them. He kept second copies of a lot of letters he sent, and so you can get close to him in a way that it's very difficult with most people that deep in time. Certainly artists, maybe heads of state or something, you might get quite a lot of correspondence. A friend of mine he was an expert on another 16th century painter, so asked me how many letters there were, and from Michelangelo, and I said, well, I was about 500 and maybe about 1,500 to him, so around 2,000 altogether. And he said, do you know how many there are from Parmigianino, who was his artist? And I said, I don't know. He said 1, and that's a much more typical state of affairs, actually. So I felt I could get going in the way that I wanted to with Michelangelo, and you couldn't do that with Giotto or somebody because there just isn't the material.
And it's pretty remarkable that he kept all that correspondence.
Well, that's remarkable, but that's only the first stage. It also needs to be not thrown away when the person who's kept it dies. That's also what happened with Van Gogh. His letters we've got basically his letters to his brother Theo, and very few of Theo's back to Vincent, because Vincent was obviously an untidy, chaotic sort of person who didn't keep much. But Theo was a neat and tidy person who put them all in, a desk drawer and kept them. And then when Theo died, his young widow, instead of chucking it all in a skip, as quite a lot of young women would, finding a lot of correspondence and paintings were apparently completely valueless by an eccentric brother of a deceased husband, she kept them all and published them, and so we've got them all. Somebody posthumously needs to care enough for documents like that to survive. And in the case of Michelangelo, he was a sort of family patriarch and much hero worshipped by the Buonarroti, who lived, his family, who lived on the money he'd made for the next several hundred years and kept everything connected with him. So a lot of those letters are still in the Casa Buonarroti in Florence, which is a museum now.
All right, so there's still direct descendants of the Buonarroti family still around.
Not anymore. The last of them died out in the 19th century, but fortunately the whole setup was transferred, and it's now, it has been for a long time, a museum, an institution with dedicated curators who also devote their lives to looking after these things and promoting the memory of the great man.
I mean, just considering just the wealth of material, as you were saying, that exists about Michelangelo, though, I do think that that's also challenging because there's just so much about him. I mean,
you could drown in it. Yes.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it is pretty daunting, actually, and the sheer amount which has been written about him is astonishing as well in many different languages, libraries worth of art history and commentary and fiction and conjecture. It's that's the downside of these people who are very well documented. It tends then to be a huge amount of discussion about them. Well, for what I wanted to do, which was to stick close to the person, the individual, I read a great deal of stuff which other people had written. I basically made my template first-hand testimony, either by Michelangelo himself or by his people who knew him well or remembered him, and I worked out from that.
I'm just thinking then of something that you wrote in The Pursuit of Art. I believe that's where I read it. You talked about working in this specific biography and saying that the work was so intense that you would sometimes just start dreaming of Michelangelo.
Oh yeah, he certainly got into my dreams. Yes, he's quite a powerful personality, sort of reaching through the centuries. And well, that's right. And I had one dream in which he popped up and offered me a glass of wine, and there's a certain kind of Tuscan white wine which his nephew was always sending him barrels of from Florence to Rome, where he lived for the last few decades of his life. And I imagine it was probably this white wine he was offering me. But anyway, I felt it was a sign that he approved of what was going on, and he was happy about the book.
That's great. That's great that he was happy about the book. I understand what you mean, because that does occasionally happen with me as well. Sometimes I just have to research for a piece that I'm working on or whatever, but that does kind of show the intensity of the work too. I mean, when you do something like that, and this may be an awful question, but I am fascinated with the process, and I'd love to ask you, since you write and research, so much different art, do you ever struggle with focus? I mean, is there a secret to maintaining a balance where you are working on so many projects at the same time and often, I would presume, jump from one period to another? Do you ever struggle with focus?
Well, I usually struggle. In fact, I would say that it's probably not a very good sign if one doesn't struggle at some point when writing a book. If it went very smoothly, I'd feel that maybe I wasn't stretching enough. I think you have to travel a distance and make discoveries yourself in order for the book to turn out properly, and that usually one experiences as some sort of crisis, and very often I get so far with the book and then I feel that this just isn't quite right, and it needs to. I start it off again, or I start in a new point. And that certainly happened with the Michelangelo book. That I wrote a lot of which was folded into the mix later on. But I couldn't quite. I didn't feel it was, the texture was right, and the focus was right, and I junked quite a few tens of thousands of words and started off again, which didn't please my publisher actually, but the schedule started to slip. But that's something happening like that is often a necessary part of the process, I find.
Here's another awful question, but what do you think about the current state of the debates or discourses around the arts and the way in which art is discussed in the modern times, especially considering the changes that the internet has brought along with it?
Well, one thing about the internet is that we spend more and more time looking at illuminated screens, which is, in some ways, it's as with all things connected with the internet, there's a tremendous upside and a tremendous downside as well. I mean, Google Images in itself is a very powerful research tool, I think, and the amount of literature that one can access and the number of connections you can make with the right kind of searches very rapidly, that's a tremendous luxury. But on the other hand, as one of the themes of the pursuit of art, that looking at images, just looking at photographs isn't really quite enough. And I think you've got to, especially with an object such as a sculpture, which is a great big lump of stone, enormously heavy, usually very sizable, or a building, the kind of things that Michelangelo produced. You've got to stand in front of it for it to have its proper effect on you. It's the internet is a bit deceptive like that. You feel things, but you actually don't, because you haven't been physically in their proximity.
Yeah, it allows you to be curious, but then actually encountering these works physically is a different thing. And also the walk to the place, everything is part of the experience.
Exactly. Yes. I've just published a book, actually. I don't know whether it is going to come out in Italy. Are you based in Italy?
I'm based a little bit everywhere. I lead quite a nomadic lifestyle, but I was born in Italy.
Well, it's out in Britain and the States, and there's going to be an Italian edition, but I'm not sure quite when that comes out. But anyway, in English, it's called Shaping the World, and I've written it with Anthony Gormley, who's a leading British sculptor today. And it's a sort of, in a way, from my point of view, it grew out of my Michelangelo interest. So I felt it would be interesting to explore sculpture altogether globally and historically with somebody who thought in those terms. And one of the themes of that too is that it's all about, or very often about, mass and weight, measuring your own body against maybe a colossal sculpture. We start off with a reclining Buddha in Sri Lanka, which is 46 feet long, and they're not necessarily all giants, but that comes into it. And so although it's a book and it's full of photographs, one of our messages is that photography isn't quite enough.
Speaking of just this sort of a lifestyle of just, traveling to so many different places and just encountering these artworks, do you sometimes revel in the romanticism of the lifestyle itself?
Well, I love Well, in a way, I love traveling. I love arriving, I suppose. I love being in distant places. I can't say I like, hanging around in airports or sitting on jet planes very much. And at the moment we don't quite know what the future of that kind of travel is going to be in the post-viral world, which perhaps will open up in the early months of next year. Yes, I've tried for me, travel's been a tremendous way of learning and widening experience, and I hope it will continue. I'm becoming uneasily aware of the amount of carbon, that's CO2 that it generates if you go to the other side of the world on a regular basis to look at works of art and talk to artists, for example.
That's true. What was the last place you traveled to?
I spent a month in Venice in autumn 2019. I've got a project about art in Venice, which I'm working on. I'm about to return to, actually, and that was just about the last place, because my wife and I were going to go to India, and then the lockdown hit and the virus arrived, and we haven't really been like everyone else. We've been largely staying close to home ever since then.
Wow, you've got so many fascinating projects going on, and I really appreciate you taking the time. But I did want to kind of end by sort of bringing something up. I know that you like jazz, and so as a fellow jazz aficionado and writer, what have you been listening to lately?
Well, I've been working my way through. I've been buying boxes. You can get collections, thematic collections. At the moment, I've been listening in depth to a few people in the early 60s, actually. McCoy Tyner. I've been working my way through a stack of 5 or 6 albums, or used to be albums, by him, and Bobby Timmons, another pianist. I've got a similar stack of things to listen to. A lot of them I'd never heard before. Drummer Roy Haynes, who's somebody I have always admired, and I see is still alive in his 90s. I interviewed him quite a while back. He's another person I've been listening to.
And is that vinyl that you're buying? Is that
no, I made a terrible mistake a while back. I had over 1,000 vinyl jazz albums, and I sold them all. I thought, I'm just not playing these. They were all on an upper floor of the house, and I was starting to use CDs, and I now bitterly regret doing that. That was, but too late now. All those original Blue Notes and things all gone. So no, I listen to CDs and streamed things and so on.
All right, Martin, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. Thanks a lot.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Matt. Thank you very much indeed.
The great Martin GAYFORD. If you are interested in the arts, Martin's works are fascinating and eye-opening. And with that ends the 2020 run of the Matt's Art Chat podcasts. I guess you could call it a season 1. This has been the 38th episode of the series, I believe. Special thanks to anyone who let me chat with them throughout the year. It has truly been a labour of love because, hey, who needs free time, right? But it has also been fascinating to connect with so many creative and interesting souls, especially during this difficult time that we have lived in this year. Chances are I will return again next year in 2021. So till the next time, I wish you a happy new year. I hope also that the seasonal madness doesn't get to you, because I know that Christmas can be tough on some folks, and there's going to be a lot of loneliness out there this year in particular. But my advice, as usual, is to stay healthy, stay safe, stay strong, and as usual, I wish you well in your own artistic ventures.